crafty friends, I'm back, and in this video I'm sharing a card I created using some of the new stamps and stencils from the Tim Holtz Stampers Anonymous release. On this card I'm using the Botanic Collage stamp set and the linked circle stencil from the mini stencil set number 52. I'm also going to share an accidental technique I discovered when I was playing around with the new stamps. I'm calling it Oxidized Stamping. I used some temporary adhesive to hold a piece of distressed watercolor paper cut to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches in place inside my MISTI. I chose to use this paper because it holds up great to a variety of wet mediums, and I knew I wanted to work with a variety of them, including distressed translucent texture paste. Here I'm working on where I want to place the stamps. Once I had figured that out, I closed the lid to pick them up and was ready to start stamping. As you can see, I hadn't cleaned my stamp very well, but I didn't worry about the ink transfer since I knew it would get covered up. I began by stamping the image using Distress Archival and Hickory smoke. I then cleaned the stamps using water and a lint-free rag and inked them with Hickory Smoke Distress Oxide ink. I repeated the inking and stamping to get a good layer of ink. I love how the image looks lighter and has an oxidized look. I first discovered this oxidized stamping technique when I was playing around with the new stamps and trying to figure out what I wanted to do. I actually stamped the Archival ink first and then stamped a different color of Oxide on top because I wanted to use a different color than what I had started off with originally. That's when I saw what happened by layering those two inks on top of each other. I wanted to add a little more stamping before I added my texture, so I selected some images from the Eccentric stamp set. I chose 3 different images and placed them in a triangle to each other. Once I had decided on their placement, I stamped them using Prize Ribbon Distress Archival ink. Next, I placed the paper into my splat box and spritzed it lightly with a bit of Salvaged Patina Distress Spray. Because I didn't use much ink, it dried rather quickly without the need for my heat tool. Next, I placed the paper into my splat box and spritzed it lightly with a bit of Salvaged Patina Distress Spray. Because I didn't use much ink, it dried rather quickly without the need for my heat tool. Now I'm ready to start adding some texture. Here I'm using one of the stencils from the mini stencil set number 52. To add the texture, I'm going to use Distressed Translucent Texture Paste. This paste dries clear and with a gloss finish. I placed the stencil towards the upper left corner and began applying the paste using a palette knife. I didn't want to cover the entire piece of paper, so I applied some to the upper left side of the paper, and then moved the stencil so I could apply some to the lower right side. When doing this, I just use my fingers to hold the stencil off of the area that I just applied the paste. Even though this paste is thick and is made to use with stencils, I still recommend applying a thinner layer so it doesn't get pushed under the stencil. After I had finished applying the texture paste, I removed the stencil and placed it into a tray of water so the paste wouldn't dry on the stencil while I moved on to the next step. While the paste was still wet, I pulled out some Distress Embossing Glaze and Salvaged Patina and Prize Ribbon. Using my fingers, I sprinkled the powder onto the paste. I'm working over a piece of typing paper folded in half. At this point, you could set the paper to the side to dry, or, if you're like me and aren't that patient, you can use your heat gun to dry the paste and melt the glaze. As you dry the paste and melt the embossing glaze, it becomes shiny like glass. Whichever way you choose, you should get the same results. At least I always have, so it's really up to you and what you prefer. And yes, that is a Swiffer I'm using to wipe away any stray embossing glaze powder. Once the embossing glaze is melted, it's time for the next step. Here I'm taking a piece of distress watercolor and I'm stamping the two butterfly images onto it using Black Soot Distress Archival ink. I only want the butterfly images, so that's why I'm placing the images like this on the paper. Next I pull out my Villainous Potion Distress ink because I want to watercolor these images. To use distress ink for watercoloring, all you have to do is tap the ink pad onto your craft mat. I then take my distress sprayer and spritz a bit of water from it. Using a water brush, I applied the water to the stamped image and then picked up a little bit of ink and painted the color onto the image. You can also use a regular paintbrush instead of a water brush. I'm trying to get just a light wash of color over the image, which is why I'm using so much water as compared to the ink. I then gradually add more color to darken some of the areas on the image. It's always easier to build up the color gradually to make it darker than to try to lighten it if you've added too much color. When I was finished with the watercoloring, I used my heat tool to dry the paper. Once it was completely dry, I used a pair of scissors to fussy cut the butterflies. The next step for this card was to add some frayed burlap distress ink to the edges using a blending tool. I like to work on my craft mat, smush the ink blending tool into the ink pad, tap off some of the ink onto my craft mat, and then drag the ink onto the edges of the paper. To add more interest to the card, I added some ink splatters using Salvaged Patina Distress Oxide spray. I did this inside a splat box with some paper towels in the bottom to soak up any excess. Using this box helps keep the mess contained and from getting ink splatters all over my desk. When working with Distress Oxide sprays, make sure to shake the spray until it is mixed well. You can tell if it is by looking at the bottom of the bottle and making sure all of the pigment has settled toward the bottom is no longer visible. Once it has mixed well, I remove the nozzle and flick the ink onto my background and the butterflies. I then dried this with my heat tool. For another bit of interest, I decided to add a bit of Distress Foundry wax and gilded. This is another medium that you want to make sure to mix thoroughly before working with it. Once it was well mixed, I applied a bit to my craft mat and then added just a tiny bit of isopropyl alcohol. Working quickly, I mixed them together using a paintbrush and then flicked the liquid wax onto my background. I repeated this process until I was happy with the amount of splatter. This wax is different than most waxes in that it must be heat set to make it permanent. I prefer to use a heat gun, like the one you would use for heat embossing, because it does the job a lot faster than the heated tool. If you want to learn more about Distress Foundry wax, feel free to check out my video. I'll make sure to have the link in the description box below. The process of heating the wax and watching it transform into its permanent shiny finish is something I seriously love to do. To finish off the card, I adhered the fussy cut butterflies using double-sided adhesive strips. For the sentiment, I used a stamp from the Noteworthy set and Black Soot Archival ink. I trimmed it into 2 strips, inked the edges, and adhered it with a bit of double-sided foam adhesive. I hope you enjoyed learning how I created this card using some of the new Holtz stamps and stencils, along with the oxidized stamping technique. Thanks so much for watching. I'm truly grateful for you. I was wondering if you could do me a quick favor and subscribe to my channel or leave me a thumbs up or a comment. If you're feeling extra generous, I'd love for you to share about my channel with your friends. All of these things help out us YouTubers so much, and it would mean so much to me to have your support.